Hi everyone. Today I will be reviewing the book Merchandising Prisoners by Byron Eugene Price. This book was recommended to me by a friend when we were having a conversation about government abuse and privatization in the private sector in general. And as it states on the cover in the title, who really pays for prison privatization is the subject of this book. And I went ahead and read it as my friend recommended, and there are a lot of things I disagree with politically with this author, but I do find this book to be very useful in regards to looking at the prison system in general. I disagree with the underlying problem of the prison system, but this book isn't necessarily written to provide a solution. As he explains in the very beginning of the book, he just wants to do an objective analysis on how effective the privatized prisons are. The first thing I would like to point out before I dive into the analysis of this book is that this book was published in 2006. A lot of things have changed politically since 2006, and well, let's be honest, unfortunately a lot of things haven't changed since 2006 as well. So that's important to note because a lot of the data and information that's cited in this book is not the most recent information out there. In the very beginning of the book, he explains his personal stance. He says that the purpose of this book is to, or at least he tries to be impartial when analyzing public versus privatization of prisons. He states that his personal stance, and I don't recall if he said he came to this conclusion before or after he did this research, but he states that he believes the police, the military, and prisons all should be a public function, and that privatization is great fiscally in just about every other area. The author suggests that the reason why prisons started popping up in greater numbers was because of the emancipation of the slaves in the South. And I found this interesting not because I find it particularly convincing, but especially with all of the social justice warrior talk going around. I hadn't heard this theory before. So he explains throughout the book that the labor that prisoners do has replaced the slave labor. He then goes on to explain that as prisons, as they started growing in numbers, there was a call for prisons to become more cost efficient, and so this is why there was a call to privatize the prisons. And his main issue with this is that he thinks that privatizing the prisons has resulted in breaching the social contract. And this is where I very strongly disagree with the author, but his definition of the social contract is that society has the right to punish the individual. And first of all, he seems to be conflating government with society, or that he believes that government properly represents society. And I disagree with that. I don't think largely that governments properly represent the populations that they control. I don't think that's self-evident, and I don't think it's true. But even if we were to agree with that premise, what he's saying is that the collective has the right to breach the rights of the individual. And for those of you who have watched my channel or are aware of who I am, you know I strongly disagree with this. I also find the use of the word contract interesting, because a contract is an agreement, meaning at least two parties are in an agreement with something. And this social contract, he seems to claim, is self-evident, but I don't recall ever signing anything or agreeing to government having the right to punish me for certain things. This social contract is involuntary. So in the book, he specifically lists 4 main issues that he has found with privatization of prisons when he did his research. So the first is, can private prisons save public revenues by doing it cheaper? Meaning, is it really more cost efficient? Is accountability lost when the state contracts with a private company? Are prisons inherently a public function and not suited for privatization? Does privatization result in a loss of capacity on the part of the state to deliver an important service? He then goes on to say the concept of privatization includes, but is not limited by, the following characteristics. And so he lists 4 main characteristics of what differentiates privatized prisons from public prisons. Number 1, governmental disconnection from a function, as in the termination of a program. 2, the sale or lease of assets such as land, infrastructure, or state-owned enterprises. 3, the substitution of publicly produced services with public payments for private services through contracts, vouchers, etc. 4, various forms of deregulation that open up an industry to private competition where previously public institutions were the only legal providers. So I do also take issue with how he defines privatized. I do not believe any prison in the United States is truly privatized. And this is because the government is involved. People are not checking themselves into these prisons voluntarily. Prisoners are not given the choice to choose the prison that they go to. So, you know, you could also say, well, the prisoners are not the customers. It is the government that is the customer, because the prisons are serving the government. And so it is the government that is sending these people to these prisons. So the government is directly involved. The author expresses the concern for prisoners losing representation and their family members losing the ability to access records when prisons are privatized. And this is a valid concern, and this is an issue. But I think what the author is overlooking here is that the prisoners and the prisoners' families, they are not the customers. It is government that they answer to. The author then goes on to explain that the private prisons make money off of each individual occupant. And so it is not in their best interest to educate these occupants so that they don't end up back in the prison system. It is not in their best interest to rehabilitate them if they have a drug addiction, because they make money. They make even more money if they end up coming back to the prison after they are released. The issue is that you can throw all this money at an individual, but unless they choose to listen to what they're being taught, unless they choose to act differently, all that money is going to be wasted. And I do not think the taxpayer should have to pay to rehabilitate anyone. It should be voluntary donation. He explains that low tax capacity, meaning the amount of taxpayer dollars available to go to a public program like the prison system, could be a reason why the South in particular, he claims, has more privatized prisons, because they don't have as much tax money coming in, and so they turn to more cost-effective options, which would be to contract out to private prisons. However, he says this may not be a direct link, because we see states that have higher tax capacity, they are still sending their prisoners out of state to these private prisons, particularly in the South. And he believes this is due to lobbying and states not wanting to have these prisoners basically in their own backyard. The author claims that it is privatization that allows for politicians to give favors to their friends who own businesses. And at least this is my impression. In the book, he says this in a way as if it is privatization's fault, or it is capitalists' fault for this. He doesn't seem to recognize that that would be the fault of the politician for doing so. He explains that it is the drug war that has been responsible for the overcrowding of prisons, and I agree with him on this. He criticizes individuals in the Reagan era for being so focused on wanting freedom in the market and wanting liberty, and he thinks that's the problem. But if these individuals truly were concerned about the principle of liberty, they wouldn't be calling for government to throw people in jail for what they choose to put in their own bodies. I found this book to be a great resource for learning how speculative prisons work. These are prisons that are built in areas where the community there's a higher demand for jobs in that area. And so what happens with speculative prisons is that the community will subsidize the prison being built in that area, and so the prisoners will be imported from other areas, from across state lines, to go to these prisons, and then those prisons will provide more income for the local community, and these prisons can also avoid corporate taxes. I believe the author does an excellent job in explaining how difficult it is for prisoners when they are sent across state lines to a prison that is away from their families and the communities that they grew up in, because he details the costs of what it costs prisoners to be able to get in contact with their families. And he says that AT&T, Sprint, MCI, they're the main companies that will put in the payphones in the prisons. Each one of those payphones, the company can make up to $15,000 a day on long distance calls. The reason that this happens is it's not because it's a privatized prison that this is a problem. It is because, again, it is the government that is the private prison's client, not the prisoners. The private prison does not answer to the prisoners. If there truly was competition in that, if the prisoners really did have the ability to have a say in the so-called service that's being provided by the prison, they would be able to choose which phone companies they would like to work with. He also details an issue that he refers to as ghost prisoners with these contracts that the government makes with these private prisons. And it's basically, in the contract, the private prison has to make so much money, and if they make their money based off of each individual prisoner, and so there has to be a quota of prisoners met. And he details an incident in Mississippi where the state of Mississippi did not meet that quota. They did not have enough people to send to prison to meet that quota, to meet that amount that the prison was requiring the state to give them. And so the state of Mississippi had to still pay for a certain amount of occupants. And this is a huge issue with those kinds of contracts, because that's taxpayer money wasted. An interesting point that he makes in the book is that prisoners are still considered citizens of the United States while they are in prison, but they are stripped of their right to vote. And he finds this to be a big issue, especially when prisoners are moved across state lines when they are sent to prison. They are moving into communities that they would not voluntarily live in otherwise, and that their laws may not properly represent their views. That he believes that the prison system would improve if the prisoners were allowed to vote, because they would most likely vote Democrat. And he claims that these rural areas that they're being moved to are more conservative, and that's why they are not properly represented. I'm not quite sure if he should be so confident that prisoners would want to vote Democrat. And one reason why he makes this assumption is that a lot of these prisoners are black and they're minority groups, and so again, this is written in 2006. I think Democrats have been exposed. It's more common knowledge now that Democrats do not have minorities' interests in mind. They claim to represent them. They expect them to vote for them. But he assumes that they would vote Democrat, and I would think if you were in prison, you would want to vote so that the government is less involved in your personal life. Generally speaking, the Republican Party at least claims that they want to lessen government's influence on the individual's life, except when it comes to drugs, generally speaking. And so I could understand if you were in prison for a drug-related crime, maybe just on that you'd be a single issue voter. On page 110 in the book, he goes on to detail how much money has gone into the prison system in comparison to how much money the government has put into public education. He says over 80 billion, a sum that is larger than annual budgets of most nations in the world, is spent annually by the United States on prison. Did that through the year 2002, the State Department of Corrections of California would spend 62% of its capital budget on new and expanded private prisons. Mississippi built 16 new correctional facilities, including 6 for-profit prisons, so 6 of the 16, in the 1990s. The state has built no new 4-year colleges or universities in over 15 years. In the last 10 years in California, 20 prisons were built versus 1 state university campus. There are almost twice as many African American men in Mississippi in prison as in colleges and universities. The state spends more per year to incarcerate a prisoner than to send them to college. I take issue with this comparison of how much money is spent on prisons as opposed to public education, because I do not believe the state, that taxpayer money should be spent on education. It should be up to the individual, especially with college. Notice he specifies colleges and universities as opposed to, elementary, middle school, and high schools. These are adults that we're talking about. Another adult shouldn't have to pay for another adult's education. An adult is responsible for themselves. They are accountable for their decisions, and it should be up to them whether or not they want to go to college, and it is up to them to come up with the money to be able to afford that. It should not be up to the taxpayers. He points out that multiple states have considered getting rid of mandatory sentencing, but this would not benefit the private prisons, and it would not help the contracts that the states have made with the prisons because they have to meet a certain quota. He has a chart. So what this chart essentially illustrates is that as the business cycle trends downward, as the economy starts to struggle, there's an increase in crime, and then therefore there's an increase in individuals being sent to prison, and then there's an increase in legislation to privatize the prisons for cost efficiency reasons. So in summary, the author believes that the main issue with prison privatization is that privatized prisons are driven by profit, and it is the drive for profit that creates the desire to have more prisoners, and they are not motivated to keep people out of prison. This is correct. So the question I would have for the author, if profit is the issue, why would making prisons a public function resolve it? In other words, does he believe that government is not motivated by profit as well? Thank you everyone for watching this book review. I would recommend reading this book. It's a great source of information on how the prison system works. A lot of things that I disagree with this author on. There are a lot of things I learned about the privatized prisons. Again, I put it in quotations because I don't believe these prisons are truly privatized, as I explained, but there are a lot of things that I learned about the prison system that I didn't know before. As far as upcoming videos, NRA is this weekend, and so stay tuned. And as far as upcoming book reviews, the next book I will be reading is Jordan B. Peterson's new book, so stay in tune for that as well. Thank you everyone. I'll see you next time.